Welcome back to part 2 of my thoughts on every Thomas promotional material on the Thomas & Friends YouTube channel. First, we'll be discussing my thoughts on two different kinds of segments on real-life railways in the UK, and those would be Down at the Station and Mr. Perkins' Railway. Let's talk about Down at the Station first. These segments were narrated by Michael Angelis and Michael Brandon respectively. And what I love about these videos is how a real-life railway operates. For example, we get episodes about how a signal works, or how points operate. And not to mention that there are different kinds of locomotives such as steam and diesel. And in my opinion, these segments are quite underrated, and I wish the reboot would teach lessons like that for today's generation instead of making it into a tech-savory cartoon. In Season 17, Down at the Station was replaced by Mr. Perkins' Railway, which has a very similar formula, but with Mr. Perkins as the narrator. One of my favorite episodes from that series was the different kinds of railway gauges, and one of them being the miniature gauge, which is a very nice tease for the Arsdale Railway engines in the CGI series. All in all, like Down at the Station, these were also very good and very underrated. And once again, it's too bad that Ben Forster died of cancer in 2017. He'll always be a great Mr. Perkins in my book. Ever since Ben Forster's unfortunate passing, Mr. Perkins was replaced by Mr. Evans the Station Master, played by Mark Morahan, the same guy who narrated seasons 17 through 21. And to be honest, I think he does a great job playing as the character. Not only he narrates certain Thomas stories like Thomas and the Beanstalk, but also teaches us arts and crafts at the end, which is pretty optional in my opinion. I mainly watch these for Mark's performance. And before there was Mr. Perkins, there was another engine driver character named Mr. Arkwright, played by Robert Slade. I thought I'd talk about this because there were only 2 DVD releases starring him. One is about him making a cardboard Thomas model, and the other is where Mr. Arkwright gets ready for a special occasion. I can't remember what it was. And in my opinion, like the Mr. Perkins segments, these are also pretty fun to watch. I really wish Mr. Arkwright appeared physically more often because he's such an interesting character. Alright, enough about that. Let's look at the Children in Need promotional videos. The first one I've seen was in 2009, where Thomas and the other classic BBC characters like Rory the Racing Car sing all kinds of cool songs. What's cool about this one is that Ringo Starr reprises his role as Thomas. While I do prefer him as a narrator for seasons 1 and 2, but I think he has a wonderful singing voice. After all, he is one of the Beatles. Oh, and the part where Sir Topham Hatt eats a ton of stuff at the table was kind of funny too. The second and final Children in Need special after that is called Share a Selfie for Children in Need, and this is where Sir Topham Hatt gathers all his STEAM team members at Tima's sheds for a selfie while wearing these yellow ears known as Pudsey ears, which I thought was pretty cute. Wait a minute, some of you guys might say. Doesn't the TV series mostly take place in the mid-20th century? Do they even have selfies back then? Well, to that I say, you're half correct. While the series technically takes place around the 40s, 50s, and 60s, but in my opinion, I'd like to believe that the series takes place in the present day, such as the 2010s. How do I know this? Well, think about it. There are a few characters that were built in the 21st century. The only 2 known examples are Carly and the Chinese diesel engine from Big World Big Adventures the movie. You can also count Kana from All Engines Go, even though she's technically a freelance design from Japan. In conclusion, the Share a Selfie one is even better than the previous episode from 2009 because it feels a lot more canon to the main TV series, and it even has a few funny lines, particularly with Sir Topham Hatt. Up next is Thomas's Great Big World, which is a series of online videos mostly starring Thomas himself, and at one point, Nia. This series I'm not going to go full detail on because it's mostly stock footage from existing episodes with Thomas and Nia narrating over what they've learned and stuff. But the most interesting one is the one with Nia titled, Why Africa is Important to Nia. I know I said I didn't like Nia that much, but I personally enjoyed this one because it talks about her continent and country of origin, which is Kenya in Africa. All in all, this is a middle of the road series, nothing too special. But the one series I think is slightly worse is known as All Aboard for Global Goals. I know I've said Big World Big Adventures in general is a mixed bag, and I still stand by that. But the problems with this series in particular is that it's trying too hard to be political, and it feels like they're forced. For example, goal number 5 talks about gender equality. Not to say that's a bad thing in general, but in the classic TV series and original books, gender didn't really matter to begin with. In fact, girls can relate to boys as well, not just other girls. In other words, this series is trying too hard to be woke. Overall, I get where the United Nations is coming from with this series, but does every individual in the entire planet have to be woke or something? I'm not saying we shouldn't recycle or make communities a terrible place to live. I'm just saying not everyone is interested in this kind of stuff. I mean, Thomas is supposed to be about talking engines who work real jobs on a real railway, and that the series is supposed to reflect the real world as much as possible. Not this political garbage. But if you enjoyed it, then that's quite understandable. Let's move on to something more interesting, like the Aussie Football Adventure series. This was made in partnership with Mattel Creations and the Australian Football League. And I've got to say, I actually enjoyed watching this series because not only Shane came back in this, but we also got to see new and interesting characters such as Tracy and Gary, who were voiced by Sabrina Frederick and Gary Ablett Jr. respectively. And while I do prefer Shane Jacobson as Shane since they both share the same first name, but I think Matthew Richardson does a decent job with Shane's voice. While I'm not really a sports fan to begin with, but what makes this interesting is that it teaches the audience about Australian football and how it's played. And to be honest, I learned a lot from this series of videos. But what's even more interesting are the new characters, Tracy and Gary. I don't know why they didn't appear in CGI, but hey, at least they've been given voice actors. All in all, Thomas's Aussie Football Adventure series is quite entertaining, and I think everyone who worked on this did an excellent job, especially Mark Morahan as a couple additional human voices. Now I want to move on to the Adventure shorts. Only 3 of them were produced, and each of them promotes a set from the Adventures range. The first one is called Shark Escape, which marks the first speaking role of Shane, though it's currently unknown who voiced him. The second one is called Space Mission, where Thomas discovers Mars and plans to use a machine to build an interplanetary railway for Sir Topham Hatt. And last but not least, Sea Monster, where Thomas escapes a giant sea monster, as well as Diesel, Airy, and Bert as a gang of pirates. I may not be a huge fan of adventures, but in my opinion, these shorts are okay. They're pretty watchable, but not as fun as the CGI Wooden Railway promotional videos because those feel more akin to the actual show. Now let's take a look at Great Race Friends Near and Far. This series takes place after the events of the Great Race, which is one of the biggest reasons why I love this series. Another thing I love about this series is that not only we get to see the Great Race contenders again, but also some of the exclusive new characters such as the Russian steam engines in the very last episode of the series, as well as Porter's brothers in another story with Vinny. In addition, like Really Useful Around the World, this series of web shorts also has more realism than Big World Big Adventures. It may not be entirely canon to the CGI series, but for me, it does feel quite canon because, as I've stated before, this takes place after the events of the Great Race. And to be frank, I love all these episodes because they show more character development for all the Great Race participants. Speaking of which, the last topic I want to talk about for now is the original 2D animated short of Young Bao and the Tiger. This is the early version of the season 24 episode of the same name, and was only featured in the Chinese release of the Great Race. but the remake is better in terms of CGI animation and additional voice acting. However, in terms of the original names and designs of the mean engines, the 2D animated version is a lot better because the one and only biggest problem with the CGI remake is that the mean engines are basically retextures of Young Bao without the smoke deflectors and Carlos of Mexico, and their old names were never mentioned at all. How lazy is that? So overall, they're both good, and they do have quite a few differences here and there. Now, I don't know how many parts of this video will be made, but I'm pretty darn sure it'll be like 3 or 4. But for now, I want to take another short break from this and make more original content for this channel. So my next video after this will probably be a top 10 video, whether it's on Thomas or not. And don't worry guys, there will be a part 3 sometime in the future, and I'll see you then too. This is Trevor Davis, signing out.